The first thing I noticed about the Great Hall was that everything in it was broken. Not visibly, not in the way that announces itself with missing pieces or cracks crawling up the walls. It was more subtle than that, the kind of brokenness that lives inside things too proud to fall apart completely. A tapestry hanging slightly askew over the eastern arch, its lower corner unraveling in a slow, silent surrender. A chair near the long table with one leg shorter than the others, propped up with a folded piece of leather someone had shoved beneath it and forgotten. Curtains so heavy with dust that they'd stopped moving even when the wind pressed through the gaps in the stone. I noticed these things because noticing was the only thing I had ever been truly good at. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the front of my skirt and told myself it was the cold. The mountain air in the Northern Territories had a particular kind of bite, the sort that doesn't warn you before it settles into your bones. I told myself it was hunger, too, because that was also true. 3 days on a cart with 2 other women and a man who wouldn't speak to any of us. Rations that amounted to dried bread and water that tasted faintly of iron. I told myself it was all of those things, and not the 30 wolves standing in 2 straight lines watching us walk through the door. There were 22 of us, women of various ages, various builds, various expressions, most of them somewhere between terrified and carefully blank. We'd been gathered from 3 different settlements along the southern ridge, brought north under orders that no one had explained in full. The word that had traveled mouth to ear along the journey was simply, "The Alpha King needs staff." Staff. As if we were walking into an inn, and not into the seat of power for the most feared pack in 7 territories. I was 24 years old. My hair, the pale gold of winter wheat, was braided back from my face in a style that my mother had taught me. Tight enough to stay through a workday, loose enough not to headache. I wore my best dress, which was not a very impressive dress. I carried a small bag with everything I owned in it, which took very little space. I was not remarkable in any visible way. That had always been my shield. The man at the front of the room was not looking at us. He stood with his back partially turned, one hand braced against the stone mantel of a fireplace, large enough to stable a horse. He was speaking in a low voice to another man, broader, shorter, with the look of someone who had taken several blows to the face and considered them character-building. I could not hear what they were saying, but I could see the set of Theron's shoulders, even from 30 feet away. Even with my shaking hands and my exhausted eyes, I could see the tension in him. It was the kind of tension that doesn't come from anger. It comes from control. From the continuous, exhausting work of holding something very large, very still. He turned. The room changed temperature. I don't mean that poetically, or not entirely. There was a physical shift, a kind of pressure that moved through the hall like a second weather system had just entered it. Several of the women near me took a small, involuntary step backward. I didn't. Not because I was brave, but because my legs had briefly forgotten what they were for. Theron, Alpha King of the Northern Pack, was not what the stories made him. The stories said monster. The stories said warlord. The stories said a man who had ended 3 rival alphas in a single winter and had not paused between them long enough to change his coat. What I saw was a man in his mid-30s, tall in the specific way that has nothing to do with height and everything to do with how a person occupies space. Dark hair, close cut. A jaw that looked like it had been assembled from harder materials than bone. A scar along his left forearm that disappeared beneath a rolled sleeve. He was dressed plainly. No ceremony, no display. Which was somehow more intimidating than gold would have been. His eyes moved over us, not unkindly. Not with the heat of selection or the cold of ownership. He looked at us the way someone looks at a problem they are trying to solve honestly. Then they landed on me. I don't know why. I was near the back, not the front. I was not the youngest, not the most striking. I had not moved or made a sound, but his gaze stopped, and for 3 full seconds I felt the specific terror of being genuinely seen by someone dangerous. "You," he said. His voice was low and carried the way stone carries sound, not by being loud, but by having nowhere to go except into you. I looked behind me. There was no one behind me. "Yes," I said. Me. Someone to my left made a small sound of disbelief at my tone. I didn't blame them. I hadn't intended a tone. I had simply answered. He crossed the hall in fewer steps than should have been geometrically possible. When he stopped in front of me, I had to recalibrate my understanding of how large a person could reasonably be. "Can you sew?" The question was so ordinary that for a moment I thought I had misheard it. Around us, the weight of the room, the lines of wolves, the other women watching, all of it pressing down, and he asked me about sewing. "Yes," I said. My voice only caught slightly. Clothing, upholstery, canvas, leather if the needle is heavy enough. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise. More like the sensation of finding firm ground after a long time on uncertain terrain. "Show me your hands," he said. I held them out. They were still trembling faintly, and I watched him notice this without comment. He looked at my palms, at the calluses along the inner fingers, the small scars from needle slips, the particular roughening that only comes from years of close work. He was quiet for a moment. "You're frightened," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't cruelty. It was just an observation delivered without decoration. "Profoundly," I said. Something, and I would spend a long time afterward trying to name it, moved through his eyes. "Good," he said. "That means you're paying attention." He turned away before I could decide how to feel about that, and addressed the man behind him with 2 quiet words. Then he spoke to all of us, and his voice filled the hall without effort. "You'll be shown to quarters. Tomorrow you'll be assigned. My steward will handle the arrangements." A pause. "You are not prisoners. If at any point you wish to return to your settlements, you will be returned. That is not a test. It is a policy." He walked back toward the fireplace. That night, in a narrow bed in a room I shared with 4 other women, I lay awake and stared at the ceiling and thought about the tapestry with the unraveling corner, about the chair with the folded leather beneath its leg, about all the small broken things I had catalogued in those first minutes, all the places where careful mending had been quietly and desperately needed. I thought about his hands on my wrists, not touching, just framing, and how he had looked at my calluses like they were credentials. "Can you sew?" Such a small question to rearrange a life around. But rearranging was what I did best. Taking something worn and finding the structure inside it, pulling the thread back through until the shape returned. I pressed my hands flat against the blanket and waited for the shaking to stop. It did, eventually. By morning, it was almost gone. The steward's name was Oswin, and he had the permanent expression of a man who had been asked to do too many things, with too few resources for too many years. He was short, gray-haired, and moved through the corridors of the keep with the brisk efficiency of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that the building would always need more than it received. He walked us through the assignments on the second morning with a clipboard and a pencil worn down to a stub, reading names and positions without looking up. Kitchen. Kitchen. Laundry. Grounds. Kitchen again. When he reached my name, he paused, just briefly, the way you pause when you find a note in a margin that changes your understanding of the page. "Grace," he said, "you're with me." The other women exchanged glances. I picked up my bag. Oswin's version of orientation was conducted entirely in motion. He walked, he talked, and he expected you to keep up with both. The keep was larger than it appeared from outside. 3 connected wings, a lower hall, a series of service corridors that ran behind the main rooms like a second, humbler skeleton beneath the formal one. He pointed at things as we passed them, and named their problems with the affection of a doctor, describing chronic conditions he had stopped expecting to cure. East wing roof leaked 3 winters ago. Warped the floorboards in the upper corridor. You'll feel the give when you walk over them. Step to the left. The library has a window that won't latch properly. In high wind it bangs, which disturbs the alpha when he's working, and a disturbed alpha disturbs everyone else. The great hall curtains haven't been properly cleaned since... He paused, calculating. A long time. The tapestries are worse. I saw the one above the eastern arch, I said. He stopped walking and looked at me directly for the first time. Corners unraveling, I continued. About 4 inches. The weft threads are intact, but the warp has loosened, probably from the humidity near the arch. It can be repaired without removing the whole piece if someone gets to it before it drops another 2 inches. Oswin stared at me for a long moment. How long have you been doing this? He asked. My mother was a seamstress. I started helping her at 7. After she passed, I ran her shop for 6 years. He wrote something on his clipboard. You'll start with the curtains in the Great Hall, he said, turning back to his walking. Then we'll see. The other women settled into their rhythms over the following week, and I began to understand the keep, the way you understand a person you live with. Gradually, through accumulation rather than revelation. There was Petra, who worked the kitchens with a competence so total it bordered on aggression. A woman in her late 30s with forearms like braided rope and opinions about stock that she was not shy about sharing. She had been brought from the same settlement as me, and she had apparently decided, without consulting me, that we were friends. She expressed this primarily by saving me portions of food and offering commentary on everything she observed. The alpha eats alone, she told me on the 3rd evening, setting a bowl of stew in front of me at the long kitchen table. Every meal. Oswin says he's always done it, since before anyway. Before what? I asked. Petra looked at me. Before his mate passed, she said, lowering her voice the way people lower their voices around tender wounds. 4 years ago. Something in the winter, they say. He hasn't... She gestured vaguely with her spoon. Recovered. In the way that matters. I thought about the chair with the folded leather under its leg. About the curtains so heavy with dust they'd stopped moving. Who was taking care of the keep before? I asked. Nobody, Petra said simply. Or nobody consistently. Staff would come, stay a few months, leave. He's not... She searched for the word. Easy. No, I agreed. He isn't. I had been in the keep 9 days when I first encountered him outside the context of other people. I had risen early, before the kitchen fires, before the other women stirred, because the Eastern Arch tapestry had been troubling my sleep. I had the tools I needed. A needle case, thread matched as close as I could manage to the original from the keep's supply room, a step stool borrowed from the laundry. The great hall was empty and blue with pre-dawn light, and I had climbed up and begun working before I had fully registered that I was not alone. He was sitting in a chair near the far window. Not the chair with the folded leather, a different one, set slightly apart from the table, angled toward the glass. He had a cup in his hand, and he was watching me. I don't know how long he had been there. Long enough that he seemed settled into the stillness, the way animals are still, not passive, but deliberately quiet. I stayed on the step stool. My needle kept moving, because stopping would have made more of the moment than it needed to be. You're up early, I said, which was not a brave thing to say, but was at least a true one. I don't sleep much, he said. The words were simple and landed without complaint, without invitation for sympathy. Just a fact he was familiar with. The corner's worse than I thought, I said, nodding at the tapestry. Someone tried to repair it before, but they used the wrong thread weight. It held for a while, but it was always going to give. A pause. My wife chose that tapestry, he said. My needle slowed. It came from a market in the Eastern Valleys, he continued. She spent an hour arguing the price down, and then gave the vendor back half of what she'd saved because she felt guilty about it afterward. Something moved through his voice that I recognized without being able to name. The specific texture of a memory that is precious and painful in equal measure. She was like that. I looked at the tapestry. At the hunters in the forest, and the pale thread of a river running through the lower third of the scene. At the corner, I was slowly, carefully pulling back together. I'll make sure it holds this time, I said. It was not a grand thing to offer. But he was quiet for a moment in a way that felt like receiving. "Oswin says you noticed the chair in the hall," Theron said, "on your first day." The leg was uneven. "He's been meaning to fix it for 2 years. "I fixed it yesterday," I said. "I shimmed it properly. Found a piece of hardwood in the supply room. It won't rock anymore." Another silence, a different quality to it. "Why?" he asked. The question surprised me into honesty. "Because it bothered me," I said. "Uneven things bother me. Things that are almost right but not quite. I can't walk past them." He turned the cup slowly in his hands. In the growing light, I could see his face more clearly than I had in the hall. The lines at the corners of his eyes. The particular tiredness that isn't physical. The way he held himself, even in stillness, as though something inside him was always working. "Most people find it easier to walk past," he said. "I know," I said. "I've never been able to figure out how." The light was changing. Somewhere in the back of the keep, the kitchen fires were starting. I could smell the smoke beginning to thread through the corridors. The day was arriving whether we wanted it or not. He stood, finished the last of whatever was in the cup. "The curtains in the east corridor," he said. "Oswin will tell you they need replacing. They don't. They need the lining restitched and the rod hardware tightened." He paused. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," I said. He walked toward the door that led to the private wing. Then he stopped, without turning. "Grace," he said. "Yes." "Thank you. For the chair." And then he was gone, and the morning light came fully through the repaired corner of the tapestry, and for a moment, the hunters in the scene seemed almost alive. I climbed down from the step stool and stood very still for a moment, pressing my hands flat against my skirt. They weren't shaking at all. 3 weeks into my time at the keep, I understood something that Oswin had never said directly, but that lived in the spaces between everything he did say. The house had stopped being cared for, not because there was no money, not because there was no staff, but because no one had been given permission to care. That was the real problem. Not the unraveling tapestry, not the curtains, not the chair. Those were symptoms. The root was something quieter and more resistant, a kind of grief that had crystallized into policy. Things stayed broken because fixing them meant admitting they had been whole before, and that wholeness had belonged to someone who was gone. I understood this the morning I asked Oswin about the upper library window. "I'll add it to the list," he said, in the tone of a man whose list had achieved a kind of philosophical permanence. "I can fix it today," I said. "I just need the latch mechanism in 20 minutes. He looked at me over his clipboard. "The Alpha hasn't authorized repairs to the private wing." "The library is in the private wing?" "The upper library is. I thought about this." "Does he use it?" "Every night," Oswin said. "From approximately the 10th bell until past midnight, most evenings. And the window bangs in high wind." "It does. And the wind has been coming from the northwest for the past 4 days." Oswin was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote something on his clipboard with his stub of a pencil, tore the small page off, and handed it to me. "I've authorized a general maintenance review of window hardware throughout the keep," he said. "Starting from the top floor and working down. That would naturally include the upper library." I took the paper. "Naturally," I agreed. The upper library was extraordinary. I had not been prepared for it. The lower library was respectable. Good shelves, organized, a working fireplace, the kind of room that serves its function without inspiring anything. The upper library was different in the way that spaces are sometimes different when someone loved them into being. It occupied the full width of the northwest tower, circular, with shelves built into the curve of the walls from floor to ceiling. A rolling ladder on a brass track that circled the room. Tall windows, 3 of them, the northernmost being the one with the faulty latch, that on a clear day would show the mountain range in its full winter severity. The room smelled of old paper, and something I could not immediately identify, something warmer underneath, like cedar and extinguished candles. Every surface that wasn't shelf was covered in the evidence of actual use. Books left open, notes in a hand I didn't recognize yet, written on loose pages and tucked between volumes. A blanket folded over the arm of a deep chair near the north window, worn soft from what appeared to be frequent use. 2 cups on the side table, both clean but both present, a detail that lodged in me without my understanding why. I found the window latch quickly. The mechanism was simple, a brass fitting that had worked loose from its housing, allowing the arm to shift in strong wind. I had a matching fitting in my repair kit, a habit from years of shop work where you learn to carry what you might need before you know you'll need it. The repair took 11 minutes. I was on my way out when I saw the curtain. It hung beside the center window, floor to ceiling, in a deep green fabric that had once been beautiful and was now a document of slow neglect, faded unevenly where the light had reached it, a hem that had come fully loose on the right side and been dragging on the floor long enough to fray. It was beyond cleaning. But the fabric itself, the weight and color of it, suggested that somewhere in the keep's supply rooms there might be something close enough to restore the sense of the room without erasing it. I ran my hand along the hem, turned it over to look at the original stitching. "What's your assessment?" I spun around. Theron stood in the doorway. He was not in his formal bearing, or rather he was, because I was beginning to understand that his formal bearing was simply how he existed, not something he put on. But there was something slightly different about him in this room. The set of his shoulders was a fraction less rigid. "I didn't hear you," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. "I know." He crossed to the chair near the north window and sat in it with the ease of long habit. "You fixed the latch. The fitting had worked loose. It won't bang anymore." I hesitated. "I hope that's... Oswin authorized the review." "I know what Oswin authorized," he said, without edge. "I also know it was your idea." He looked at the curtain, then at my hand still resting on the hem. "You were assessing it." "It can't be saved," I said. "The fabric is too far gone. But the room's proportions are specific enough that a replacement would need to be made, not bought. I'd need to find matching material or something close, and it would take... time." "How much time?" "A week if the material is available, more if I need to source it." He was quiet, looking at the curtain. "My wife made that curtain," he said. The same tone as before, not a wound displayed, just a truth acknowledged. She wasn't a seamstress. It took her most of the winter. She was very proud of it, and pretended she wasn't. I looked at the curtain again, at the care in the original stitching, even where it had come loose, the way someone had worked longer rows in places that wouldn't show, for the sake of doing it correctly. "I can see that," I said quietly. "The technique is..." She cared about it. Something in his face shifted the way ice shifts before it gives. Not breaking, just acknowledging the change in temperature. "I don't want it replaced," he said finally, "but I don't want to watch it come apart by degrees either." I nodded slowly. "There's a middle option. I can't restore it to new, but I can stabilize it. Reline it from the back with a supporting fabric. It won't be visible, but it will take the stress off the original. Resecure the hem in a way that preserves the original stitching pattern. It won't last forever, but it will last." He looked at me for a long moment. In the afternoon light of the northwest tower, his face was complicated, relief and resistance moving through it in the same current. "Do that," he said. I came back 3 afternoons in a row. He was there each time. Not intrusively, he read or wrote, or simply sat with the particular quality of stillness I was beginning to recognize as his natural state. We did not always speak. Sometimes an hour would pass in near silence, with only the sound of my needle and the occasional turn of a page. But sometimes we did speak, and those conversations had a quality I had not encountered before. Unhurried, precise, with the sense that both of us were choosing our words not to impress, but to be accurate. He asked me about the settlements on the southern ridge. Not politically, Genuinely. The way someone asks who has been too long in one place and is curious about the texture of another. I told him about the market days, about the particular smell of the ridge after rain, about the community of women who had run small shops along the main road and looked out for each other in the ways that people do when official support is unreliable. He listened with complete attention, which was more disorienting than any amount of power or stature could have been. I asked him about the keep's history, carefully, keeping to the architecture, the practical past. He answered in the same register, and occasionally, without seeming to decide to, went deeper. The North Tower had been built by his grandfather, who had an obsession with light. The rolling library ladder had been an indulgence he'd allowed himself the first year of his rule, and had been quietly embarrassed about ever since. The mountain facing the north window changed color in the hour before a storm in a specific way that he'd never been able to adequately describe to anyone. Like pewter, I said, on the third afternoon. But moving, like something breathing underneath the metal. He turned from the window and looked at me. Yes, he said, exactly that. Outside, the wind shifted. The north window stayed perfectly still. What I didn't see coming was Rena. She arrived on the 4th week, a woman from the Western Pack, tall and deliberate, with the kind of beauty that announces its own importance. She came as a diplomatic guest, accompanied by 2 attendants, and she moved through the keep with the ease of someone who had been calculating her position in rooms before she entered them. She sat at the long table for the formal dinner, 2 seats from Theron. She laughed at the right moments. She knew which questions to ask and which silences to fill. And she looked at me. Just once, briefly, when she noticed Theron lean slightly forward as I passed behind his chair to refill the candles in the side sconce, with the precise, pleasant expression of someone filing information for later use. I went back to the kitchen. Petra was waiting with a look that meant she had been watching. "She's here about an alliance," Petra said, handing me a cup of tea I hadn't asked for. "Western Pack has been pushing for a formal bond for 2 years. Everyone knows it." "That's not my concern," I said. "No," Petra agreed. She looked at me steadily. "But you're shaking again." I looked down at my hands. She was right. Rena stayed for 10 days. I know this because I counted them the way you count difficult things. Not obsessively, but with the particular awareness of someone who has learned that knowing the length of discomfort is preferable to being surprised by it. 10 days of watching her occupy the formal spaces of the keep, with a practiced ease that I could not fault and could not imitate. 10 days of dinner tables and corridor conversations, and the sound of her laughter, which was genuine enough to be disarming, traveling from the receiving room to wherever I happened to be working. I kept my hands busy. This was not a strategy so much as a survival mechanism. The same one I had used after my mother passed, after the shop became too heavy to carry alone, after every version of loss that I had navigated by finding the next broken thing and addressing it. The east corridor curtains were finished. I started on the window casements in the lower hall, recaulking the stone frames where decades of temperature shift had opened thin gaps that let the cold in. Oswin found me tasks faster than I could complete them, which I suspected was both genuine need and quiet understanding. The other women had noticed something. Not Petra. Petra understood more than she said, and said more than was strictly necessary, and was therefore reliable. But the others had begun to watch me with the particular attention people give to situations they find interesting and want to see resolved. Mira, who worked the laundry and had sharp eyes and a sharper memory, stopped me in the corridor on the 6th day of Rena's visit. She asked Oswin who fixed the tapestry, Mira said without preamble. I kept walking. Did she? He told her it was you. Mira fell into step beside me. She asked what else you'd done. He gave her the full list. A pause. She went quiet afterward, the kind of quiet that means thinking. People think, I said. It's generally harmless. Not always, Mira said, and peeled off toward the laundry without further elaboration. The conversation I had not been anticipating happened on the 7th evening. I was in the upper library. This had become, over the past weeks, a space I occupied with a permission that had never been formally granted and never needed to be, Theron had not asked me to stop coming, and so I continued, working on various small repairs, and occasionally simply existing in a room that had grown comfortable to me in the way that certain spaces do when enough quiet hours have been spent in them. He was at his desk when I arrived, writing. I took my usual position near the center window with a piece of stonework regrouting that the tower wall had needed for some time. We had been in companionable silence for perhaps 40 minutes when he set down his pen. "Rena has made a formal proposal," he said. I kept my attention on the stonework. My hands continued their work with a steadiness I was faintly proud of. "An alliance," I said. "A bond," he said. The distinction was specific, and both of us knew it. I pressed the grouting into the gap with my tool and smoothed it evenly. "She is well suited to it," I said. This was true. I had watched her for 7 days, and I could see the intelligence in her, the capability, the genuine fitness for the role. It cost me something to say it, and I said it anyway because it was accurate. "Yes," he said. "She is." Silence. "I haven't answered her," he said. I didn't respond to this. It was not mine to respond to. "Grace." Something in the way he said my name, not sharp, not demanding, but with a weight that suggested the word had been thought about before it was spoken, made me set down my tool. I looked at him. He was watching me with an expression I had not seen on him before. The control was still there. It was always there, the structure he maintained as reflexively as breathing. But there was something beneath it that was not controlled. Something that looked, at a distance that I was carefully maintaining, like a question. "She asked me if there was a reason I hadn't answered immediately," he said. "She is perceptive. She said," he paused, "she said she had the impression my attention was occupied. I was very still." "I told her she was mistaken," he said. Something moved through me. I identified it, precisely and without mercy, as disappointment, which told me something I had been carefully avoiding knowing. "That was the right answer," I said. "Was it?" "She came with a purpose. You have responsibilities. An alliance with the Western Pack would be strategically—" "I know what it would be strategically," he said, with a quiet that was not quite patience. "I've been managing strategy since I was 19. I don't need a summary." I looked back at my work. "Then I don't know what you want me to say," I said. "I don't want you to say anything diplomatic," he said. "I have an entire council for that." A pause. "I want you to say something true." The wind pressed at the north window. It held. The latch stayed firm. "I think," I said carefully, "that you are a man who has been very alone for a long time and has become so accustomed to it that you've started to mistake it for preference." The silence afterward was the longest kind. "That is a very direct observation," he said. "You asked for something true." "I did." Another pause. "And what would you say about yourself, using the same standard?" I thought about my shop on the southern ridge, about the years of pouring my attention into other people's torn things, other people's broken seams, finding in the repair of objects a safety that human connection had always complicated. About arriving here with a bag that took very little space, and hands that shook, and a very small expectation of being anything more than useful. "I would say," I said slowly, "that I have also been very alone for a long time, and that I am somewhat better at noticing what is broken in rooms than in myself." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, and this was the thing I would return to afterward, the detail that lodged itself permanently. He got up from the desk, crossed to the window where I was working, and crouched down so that we were level. He looked at the grouting I'd been smoothing into the wall, at the neat, careful line of it, at the place where the gap had been, and was now filled. "You've been doing this since you arrived," he said. "Not just the sewing. Everything. Things needed doing." "Yes, but you didn't do it the way someone does a job. You did it the way someone does something they care about." He looked at me, not the wall. Why? I thought about it honestly. Because this place has good bones, I said. The structure is sound. It just needs tending. And I think things that have good bones deserve to be tended. Something in his expression came undone at the edges, not dramatically. Nothing about him was dramatic. But there was a shift, like a door that has been held shut for a very long time releasing its latch. Just slightly, just enough for light to come under it. Rena left on the 10th day. She was gracious about it, which I respected. She had gone to Theron the previous morning, and they had spoken privately for some time. And when she emerged, she had the composed expression of someone who had received an honest answer and was deciding to be dignified about it. She passed me in the corridor on her way out, stopped. "You fixed the tapestry in the Great Hall," she said. "Yes." She looked at me for a moment. Not unfriendly, not exactly warm, evaluating. "He talked about it at dinner the first night," she said. "The tapestry, the chair, the windows." She paused. "I've been to this keep 4 times over the past 3 years. He never talked about the keep before. I didn't know what to say to this, so I said nothing." She adjusted the strap of her traveling bag. "You're better suited to it than I am," she said. "Not because of the sewing." She left without explaining what she meant, and her retinue followed, and the main doors closed behind her with the solid sound of old wood and iron. What happened next, I did not expect, though perhaps I should have. 3 days after Rena's departure, I was in the storage room beneath the east wing, inventorying fabric stock, when Oswin found me with an expression that was new. Something between urgency and controlled alarm. "There's a situation," he said. "The Southern delegation." I stood up from the crates. "What Southern delegation?" 3 representatives from the Southern Ridge settlements arrived this morning, unannounced. He paused. "They're claiming that the women brought north were taken under false pretenses, that there was no proper consent process. They're demanding an immediate account and threatening to escalate to the Territorial Council if they don't receive one." I went very still. "Are they wrong?" I asked. Oswin looked at me with the honesty I had come to rely on him for. "The process was expedient," he said carefully. "Proper by pack law, not necessarily by human custom." "And Theron?" "He's meeting with them now. It's not going well." Oswin looked at me directly. 3 of the women have already said they want to return, which they will, with full provision, as he promised. But the delegation is making a larger claim, that the keep has been holding women in de facto servitude. The story they're building is specific, and it's damaging. "And what's the truth?" "The truth is complicated," Oswin said, "as it usually is." I took off my work apron and folded it over the crate. "Where is he meeting them?" I said. Oswin blinked. "Grace." "Where, Oswin?" He told me. The receiving room was the most formal space in the keep, a room designed to communicate authority, with high ceilings and a long table, and the kind of deliberate symmetry that reminds visitors they are in someone else's territory. I had never been inside it. I had repaired the hinges on its door 3 weeks prior, and had looked in long enough to note that the northern wall tapestry was in better condition than the eastern hall one. And then I had moved on. I stood outside it now and listened. The delegation's spokesperson had a voice that carried a man named Aldrich, from the largest settlement on the Southern Ridge, who had apparently made a career of representing grievances, and was good at it. He was using the particular tone of someone who has prepared his argument, and is now performing it rather than conducting a conversation. Words like coercion and absence of free choice and exploitation of vulnerable women came through the door with the precision of tools selected for a specific job. Theron's voice was lower, controlled, answering point by point with the patience of someone who knows they are being maneuvered and is choosing not to be moved. But I could hear the thing underneath it, the thing that only registered after weeks of learning the specific frequency of him. He was on uncertain ground, not because he was wrong about the law, but because Aldrich wasn't arguing law. He was arguing story. And story, in front of a delegation that would carry news back to 3 settlements and eventually to the Territorial Council, was the more dangerous terrain. I opened the door. The room turned. 4 men at the delegation's side of the table, Theron, and 2 of his senior wolves on the other. Oswin, who had apparently arrived before me, stood near the wall with his clipboard, and the expression of a man watching events accelerate past the point where a clipboard is useful. I walked to the table. "Grace," Theron said. 1 word. Not a warning. A question inside a word, asking what I was doing and whether I was certain. I looked at Aldrich. "I'm from the Southern Ridge," I said. "I was brought here among the first group, 5 weeks ago." Aldrich studied me. "Then you're one of the women whose situation we're here to address." "I'm one of the women whose situation you've constructed a narrative about," I said, without asking us what it actually is. The room was very quiet. "The process by which we were brought here was expedient," I continued. "I won't defend the method as perfect, but I will tell you what I found when I arrived. I was told directly on the first day that I was free to leave at any time, that this was not a test. Those were the Alpha King's exact words." I looked at Aldrich steadily. "I have been here 5 weeks. I have repaired approximately 40 separate elements of this keep, not because I was ordered to, but because it needed doing, and I am a person who cannot walk past broken things." "You may have adapted to your circumstances," Aldrich said carefully. "That is a known response to—" "I run a shop," I said. "I ran it alone for 6 years after my mother passed. I have made every consequential decision in my adult life independently. If I had wished to leave, I would have left." A pause. "The 3 women who want to return home should be returned home today, with provisions, as was promised. I support that completely. But the claim that we are held here against our will is not the story of this keep, and you do not have the right to tell it as though it is." Silence. Then one of the other delegates, a woman I had not initially noticed, seated at the far end, spoke. "What would you call it, then? What is the story of this keep?" I thought about the tapestry corner, slowly unraveling. About the chair and the folded leather. About curtains too heavy with dust to move, and a window that banged in every storm, and a library that smelled of extinguished candles and contained a blanket worn soft from years of solitary use. "A house that forgot how to be cared for," I said, "and a group of people trying to remind it." The delegation stayed another 2 hours. The 3 women who wished to leave were brought in, treated with respect, provided with everything they needed for the journey and more, and sent home with a formal written acknowledgement from Theron that the initial recruitment process would be revised to include a proper consent documentation going forward. Aldrich left without conceding that his framing had been overstated, but he left, and the Territorial Council was not contacted, and the story that traveled back to the Southern Ridge was a quieter and more accurate one. I sat in the kitchen afterward with Petra and Mira and 2 other women and drank tea and felt the particular exhaustion of having spent words on something that mattered. Petra refilled my cup without being asked. "That was either very brave or very foolish," she said. "Probably both," I said. Mira was watching me with her sharp eyes. "He looked at you," she said. "When you walked in. Before you said anything." "People look at people who walk into rooms," I said. "Not like that," she said, and would not be drawn further. Theron found me that evening in the upper library. I was not working. I had simply gone there because it was where I went when I needed to think, which told me something I had already acknowledged to myself, and was still in the process of accepting. I was sitting in the deep chair near the north window, with a book I was not reading, watching the mountain change in the last light. He came in without announcement, which was his habit and his right, and stood for a moment inside the door. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," I agreed. He crossed to his desk but didn't sit, stood with one hand on the back of the chair looking at me. "Why did you?" I set the book down on my knee. Outside, the mountain had gone to pewter. The breathing kind, the kind neither of us had been able to describe until I'd found the word for it. Because it was true, I said, and because you were arguing law when the argument needed something else. I paused. Someone who had actually been here. He was quiet for a long moment. You told them you can't walk past broken things, he said. Yes. Does that apply to people as well? I looked at him. At the lines of him. The control, the tiredness, the specific careful loneliness of a man who had been managing his own grief with the same efficiency he applied to everything else, and had not, until recently, had any reason to do otherwise. It seems to, I said quietly. He came around the desk and sat in the chair across from mine. Not far, not close. Exactly the distance of honesty. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be clear about that. It has been a long time, and I am not skilled at it anymore, if I ever was. I'm not skilled at it either, I said. I'm better with curtains. Something moved through his face that was the closest thing to a smile I had seen from him. Not the full expression, more like the shadow of one, the shape a smile leaves behind after it's been absent a long time. Then we'll proceed slowly, he said. Slowly suits me, I said. What followed was not a dramatic transformation. That is the thing about real change. It doesn't arrive with weather. It arrives the way good repairs hold, invisibly, structurally, in the places that don't show. Over the weeks that came after, I watched the keep become something different. Not unrecognizable. Its bones were the same, the stone and the timber, and the mountain light, but inhabited differently. The great hall curtains were cleaned and rehung and moved again in the wind. The tapestry above the eastern arch held its corner without giving. The chair sat level at the long table. The upper library window stayed silent through 3 storms. The women who remained settled into something that resembled a community. Petra ruling the kitchen with her particular brand of affectionate ferocity. Mira cataloging the keep's inventory with a thoroughness that quietly transformed its efficiency. Others finding their places in the structure with the naturalness of people who had been given actual choice and had chosen to stay. Theron began eating in the hall. Not every meal, but some of them. And on the evenings when he did, the quality of the room was different, less like a formal space and more like a place where people gathered because they wanted to be gathered. Oswin, who had been managing impossible logistics for years with a stub of pencil and an expression of permanent besieged competence, was provided with 3 additional staff, a new supply budget, and the first real organizational structure the keep had had in 4 years. He accepted these developments with the dignity of a man who had waited a long time and had not complained about the waiting, and then went back to his clipboard and began working through the list with visible satisfaction. 6 months after the day, I had stood shaking in the great hall with my hands pressed flat against my skirt. I was in the upper library on a winter afternoon when Theron came in and set a cup of tea on the table beside my chair without being asked. It was such a small thing. It was such a complete thing. I looked up at him. "The North Mountain," he said, nodding toward the window. I turned. Outside in the late afternoon light, the peak had gone to pewter, moving, breathing, the way it did in the hour before weather. "Storm tonight," I said. "Yes." He sat in his chair, picked up his book. Outside the light was shifting and the mountain was alive with it, and the window beside us held perfectly still. We sat together in the warm quiet of it, and I thought about the woman who had arrived here with a small bag and shaking hands, and a very limited expectation of what she might be allowed to become. I thought about how wrong she had been. We were formally bonded in early spring, in a ceremony that Theron kept deliberately small, and that Petra nonetheless managed to transform into an occasion of considerable warmth and a truly impressive quantity of food. Mira cried, which she would deny to her last day. Oswin did not cry, but he wrote something on his clipboard, and then stood straighter than usual for the rest of the afternoon, which amounted to the same thing. My hands did not shake. I had repaired this house stitch by stitch, seam by seam, in all the ways that a house can need repairing, and it had repaired me in return, quietly, structurally, in the places that don't show until the light falls right, and you realize the gap that was there is simply gone. The morning after, I stood at the north window of the upper library and looked at the mountain. Clear sky, fresh snow on the peak, the particular blue of a spring morning at altitude. Behind me, I heard him come in, the sound of his particular stillness filling the room. I didn't turn right away. I just looked at the mountain and felt the extraordinary, ordinary weight of being exactly where I was supposed to be. Then I turned, and the room was warm, and the window held, and everything that had been broken had become something stronger in the mending. The way the best repairs always are, invisible to the eye but present in the bone, holding in all the places that matter. It was, in every way that counted, enough. It was in every way that counted, everything.